The silence in the Penthouse library wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight pressing against my ribs, thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching storm. I stood on one side of the mahogany table, my hands gloved in white cotton, hovering over a 12th century manuscript that was worth more than my entire education. On the other side stood Seraphina Blackwood. She didn't look at the priceless vellum between us. She looked at me. Her gaze was unflinching, stripping away the professional armor I'd worn for a decade. This commission was supposed to be a simple archival job, a retreat into the dust of history. Instead, the air charged then, shifting from dust and paper to something far more volatile. It started with the arrival at the Blackwood estate. That ascent into the clouds should have warned me. My worn leather satchel, scarred from archives in Rome and damp basements in London, looked violent against the pristine, sterile luxury of the private elevator. The mirrored walls threw back a reflection of someone who didn't belong. A curator in practical tweed standing inside a diamond. I have always arranged my life like a well-ordered index, preferring the controlled environment of an archive, where the temperature is constant and the social expectations are zero. Mr. Blackwood, the man who signed the check, didn't care about history. He collected art the way he collected companies, aggressively, for the sake of possession rather than appreciation. He viewed this library as an asset valuation for a portfolio that was already overflowing. When the elevator doors slid open, I wasn't stepping into a sanctuary. I was stepping into a vault. The library was a 2-story architectural marvel of glass and mahogany, breathtaking in its scale, but distinctly cold, a display case designed to be looked at, not touched. The sterile air conditioning hummed like a low threat. I sat at my station on the long oak table, arranging my brushes, my magnifying glass, and my laptop with the ritualistic order that calms my nervous system. I needed that order. The space was too open, the city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered no privacy, only a terrifying, panoramic view of the rain lashing against the glass. I focused on the texture of the leather binding, grounding myself in the tactile reality of the work. That's when I saw her. Not directly, but as a ghost, caught in the reflection of the glass wall. Seraphina. She stood on the mezzanine, a silhouette against the gray sky, watching me. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just observed, her posture rigid, wearing her wealth like a suit of armor that was perhaps a size too tight. In that reflection, she looked less like the heiress to a shipping empire and more like a bird pacing the perimeter of a gilded cage. I didn't turn around. I kept my head down, pretending to examine the provenance of a sketch. The power dynamic in the room was vertical and absolute. I was there to serve the collection. She owned it. I preserved history. Her family consumed it. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes with being hired help in a place like this, even when you possess the expertise they lack. You are expected to be efficient, silent, and functionally non-existent. But Seraphina's reflection didn't look at me like I was furniture. She looked at me with a sharp, suspicious intelligence that made the skin on my arms prickle. I had spent years building a life of carefully constructed solitude, a fortress of books and silence where I was safe from the chaotic demands of emotional intimacy. I thought I could maintain that here. I thought I could do the job, take the money, and leave without leaving a trace of myself behind. I was wrong. The library wasn't empty. It was occupied by a woman who seemed to vibrate with a frequency that disrupted my own. I turned a page, the sound loud in the vast room, and felt the weight of her attention shift. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a challenge. I thought I was alone with the books, but the back of my neck prickled with the awareness of being watched. The days settled into a rhythm that I tried to impose on the chaos of my own nervous system. My work is tactile, a sequence of precise, known variables. It is the feel of vellum that has survived fires, the smell of iron gall ink that bites the back of the throat, and the soft, scratching sound of my graphite pencil on the cataloging cards. This repetition grounds me. It is a way of ordering the universe, one book at a time. But in that library, the order felt fragile, constantly threatened by the variable I couldn't catalog. Serafina began to inhabit the space with me, not as a participant, but as a feature of the landscape. She never announced her arrival. I would simply look up from a 16th century binding and realize the air pressure in the room had dropped, heavy with her presence. She sat in a high-backed velvet chair near the rain-streaked window, a book often forgotten in her lap as she stared out at the gray city. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge me. She just existed there, a static point of high tension in the periphery of my vision. I began to study her, the way I study a manuscript with missing pages. Her posture was rigid, a straight line drawn against the soft velvet. She held herself with a discipline that looked painful, wearing her wealth like armor. But armor is heavy. I saw the fatigue in the line of her neck, the way her fingers drummed a silent, anxious rhythm on the armrest. I know better than anyone that the tighter the binding, the more likely the spine is to crack. The proximity became a sensory landscape I couldn't navigate around. The library was vast, a cavern of shadows and glass. Yet the scent of her tea, a complex, smoky blend that smelled of pine forests and burnt sugar, drifting across the 20 feet of oak table between us, felt invasive. It invaded my sterile workspace, mixing with the dust of the books. I could hear the rustle of her silk blouse when she shifted, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. The sound of her turning a page began to synchronize with my own breathing. I found myself waiting for it, anticipating the rhythm of her movements. It was distracting. It was overwhelming. The silence that stretched between us wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence of a library. It was the loaded silence of a courtroom before a verdict. I felt the weight of her gaze even when her head was turned. It forced me to perform competence. I moved with exaggerated precision, handling the books with a reverence I hoped would shield me from her scrutiny. I wanted to be flawless. I wanted to show her that while she owned these things, I understood them. On the second afternoon, my hands stilled completely. I had pulled a slender volume from a lower shelf, expecting another dry recounting of maritime law or estate holdings. Instead, the script that greeted me was familiar, intimately so. It was written in my grandmother's language, a dialect of the old country that I hadn't heard spoken since I was a child. The ink was faded, but the words sang of mountains and loss. For a moment, the cold glass walls of the penthouse dissolved. I ran my thumb over the text, a bridge spanning the vast distance between my personal history, smelling of wood smoke and poverty, and this sterilized, climate-controlled vault. It was a jarring reminder of who I was and who she was not. I was the keeper of these stories. She was just the vault. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over that small book, a desire to hide it from the cold luxury of the room. But even as I traced the familiar letters, I felt her attention snap to me. On the second afternoon, my hands stilled completely. I had pulled a slender volume from a lower shelf, expecting another dry recounting of maritime law or estate holdings. Instead, the script that greeted me was familiar, intimately so. It was written in my grandmother's language, a dialect of the old country that I hadn't heard spoken since I was a child. The ink was faded, but the words sang of mountains and loss. For a moment, the cold glass walls of the penthouse dissolved. I ran my thumb over the text, a bridge spanning the vast distance between my personal history, smelling of wood smoke and poverty, and this sterilized, climate-controlled vault. It was a jarring reminder of who I was and who she was not. I was the keeper of these stories. She was just the vault. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over that small book, a desire to hide it from the cold luxury of the room. But even as I traced the familiar letters, I felt her attention snap to me. She had sensed the shift in my focus, the crack in my professional veneer. The silence held for 3 days, thick and suffocating, until she finally decided to test the structural integrity of my patience. On the second afternoon, my hands stilled completely. I had pulled a slender volume from a lower shelf, expecting another dry recounting of maritime law or estate holdings. Instead, the script that greeted me was familiar, intimately so. It was written in my grandmother's language, a dialect of the old country that I hadn't heard spoken since I was a child. The ink was faded, but the words sang of mountains and loss. For a moment, the cold glass walls of the penthouse dissolved. I ran my thumb over the text, a bridge spanning the vast distance between my personal history, smelling of wood smoke and poverty, and this sterilized, climate-controlled vault. It was a jarring reminder of who I was and who she was not. I was the keeper of these stories. She was just the vault. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over that small book, a desire to hide it from the cold luxury of the room. But even as I traced the familiar letters, I felt her attention snap to me. She had sensed the shift in my focus, the crack in my professional veneer. The silence held for 3 days, thick and suffocating, until she finally decided to test the structural integrity of my patience. The silence held for 3 days, thick and suffocating, until she finally decided to test the structural integrity of my patience. It didn't happen with a dramatic confrontation or a demand for service. It happened over a charcoal sketch, a small, unassuming study of a hand holding a pomegranate. I had it laid out on the acid-free paper, my magnifying glass hovering over the corner signature. To the trained eye, my eye, it was clearly a late 19th century imitation, likely from a Parisian student attempting to mimic the pre-Raphaelites. I was already writing the tag, my pencil scratching a definitive School of Rossetti, circa 1890, onto the card. The sound was rhythmically soothing, a small affirmation of my control over this chaotic collection. You've misidentified the provenance. The voice didn't come from a distance. It was close, startlingly so, dropping into the quiet space like a stone into a still pool. I froze, the graphite tip snapping under the sudden pressure of my hand. I hadn't heard her move from the velvet chair. I hadn't heard the rustle of silk or the soft tread of her slippers on the Persian rug. I looked up, and she was there, standing on the opposite side of the oak table. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the sketch, her expression unreadable, devoid of the polite deference or the imperious command I expected from women of her station. This was something else. This was clinical. "Excuse me?" I asked. My voice was steady, but my pulse initiated a slow, angry thud against my collarbone. I don't like being interrupted, and I despise being corrected by amateurs. I assure you, the shading technique is characteristic of the French revivalists. "It isn't French," she said. She reached out, her hand hovering over the sketch, but not touching it. Her fingers were long, unadorned by rings, and steady. "And it isn't an imitation. Look at the cross-hatching on the wrist. That tension in the line work? That's anger, not study. It's an original Siddle. Elizabeth Siddle. Done 3 months before she died. I stared at her. The air in the room seemed to thin, sharpening the edges of everything. It wasn't a bratty interjection from a bored socialite. It was a precise, academic strike. I looked back at the drawing, really looked at it, past the obvious style, and into the pressure of the charcoal. She was right. The emotional weight of the lines was too heavy for a mere exercise. It was raw. The auction records listed as anonymous French, I countered, instinctively reaching for my laptop, pulling up the digital archive as a shield. Christie's, 1954. Attributed to, the records are wrong, she cut in. Her voice was cool, smooth, and utterly, absolutely certain. My great-grandfather bought it directly from a private seller in London who knew the Rossettis. The paperwork was lost in the war, so the auction house made a safe guess. But family history isn't a guess. We know who sat for it. We know why she drew it. She finally looked up from the paper, and her eyes locked onto mine. The impact was physical. For the first time, I wasn't seeing the reflection in the glass or the silhouette on the mezzanine. I was seeing a scholar trapped in the body of a millionaire's daughter. There was a challenge in her gaze, a sharp, dangerous intelligence that had been bored out of its mind until this exact moment. She wasn't fighting me for dominance. She was fighting me for the truth of the object. My defense crumbled, replaced by a reluctant, terrifying rush of respect. I value precision above all else. I curate because the past is set, because facts do not change, because the truth is a solid thing you can stand on. Seraphina Blackwood had just kicked the floor out from under me. Not with money, but with knowledge. Siddle, I murmured, correcting the tag. The wrist, you're right. It's too heavy for a study. She was losing the use of her hand, Seraphina said, the tension in her shoulders dropping an inch. She was trying to capture the strength before it was gone. We stood there, the sketch between us, the silence returning but changed. I looked at her, the sharp cut of her jaw, the intelligence burning behind those guarded eyes, and felt a dangerous pull. It wasn't just that she was beautiful. That was a given. It was that she was right. She had proven she could bite. And to my surprise, I wanted to see if she would do it again. By Thursday, the work had migrated to the upper stacks, and the architecture of the library turned hostile to my need for distance. The lower level was a showroom, vast and performative, but the mezzanine was a vault. The aisles here were narrower, the mahogany shelves looming high like canyon walls that blocked out the panoramic safety of the city view. It was a space designed for storage, not comfort, and the air here was stagnant, holding the dust of 3 centuries in suspension. For someone like me, who experiences the world as a constant, unfiltered assault of sensory data, this environment was a minefield. The silence wasn't empty. It was loud with the hum of the climate control and the settling of the building. I could hear the microscopic shifting of paper, the groan of wood expanding in the humidity. And now, the silence was loud with her. Seraphina followed me up. She didn't have a reason to be there. There were no velvet chairs here, no tea service. She stood at the end of the aisle while I cataloged a row of Victorian naturalist journals, her presence acting like a heat source in a cold room. I could feel where she was without looking. It was a prickling awareness against the back of my neck, a disruption in the magnetic field of my solitude. I focused on the spine of a leather-bound volume, counting the cracks in the binding to regulate my breathing. 1, 2, 3. The dust motes danced in the single beam of track lighting, chaotic and uncontrollable. How do you stop them from falling apart? Her voice was low, absorbed instantly by the thousands of pages surrounding us. It wasn't a demand. It was a genuine inquiry, stripped of the socialite affectation she wore downstairs. I didn't turn immediately. I kept my eyes on the crumbling leather, needing the barrier of the object between us. "Acid-free tissue," I said, my voice sounding too loud, too clinical in the confined space. "Climate control. And we don't touch them unless we have to. The oil from human skin is destructive. We don't touch them," she repeated, testing the weight of the phrase. I turned then, holding the book like a shield against my chest. I expected her to be looking at the journals, at the work. She wasn't. She was looking at me. It wasn't the polite, glancing contact of a casual conversation. It was a study. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and absolutely unflinching. She was reading the lines of my face with the same intensity she had applied to the Siddle sketch, mapping the tension in my jaw, the hesitation in my posture. It was terrifying. In the archives, I am a pair of hands. I am a brain. I am a function. I am the person who preserves the story, never the subject of it. Under her gaze, I was suddenly, violently, a woman. The employee status dissolved, leaving me exposed in the harsh track lighting. I felt the urge to adjust my glasses, to smooth my tweed jacket, fidgets that would betray my discomfort. I forced myself to stand still, to meet that gaze with a curator's detachment, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against the book in my arms. "It must be lonely," she said, stepping closer. She wasn't talking about the books. "It's precise," I countered, though the word felt weak, a paper wall against a flood. "Precision is safer than people. People are messy. They have agendas. Books just want to be read." "Is that what you think?" She reached out, her finger tracing the spine of a book next to my shoulder. She was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her, warm and expensive, overwhelming the smell of old paper. "Or is it just a different kind of cage? You lock yourself away with dead things so you don't have to deal with the living." We started talking about the author of the journal, a woman who spent her life painting birds she could never own, trapping their likenesses on paper because she couldn't keep the real things. Serafina spoke of the woman's isolation not as a historical fact, but as a lived reality. She understood the texture of a life lived behind glass. We weren't discussing history anymore. We were mapping the geography of our own loneliness. The professional distance I had carefully maintained was evaporating, burned off by the heat of her proximity. The aisle was too narrow. The silence was too heavy. The distance between us had shrunk to the width of a spine, and the air was becoming difficult to breathe. The next hour was a blur of silence, but the air remained thin, stripped of oxygen by the sheer proximity of her. I needed to access the upper tier of the geography section to verify a series of maps. There was a specific atlas, a massive 17th century folio bound in pigskin and heavy brass, resting on a shelf just beyond my comfortable reach. I am not a short woman, but this library was built for giants, designed to make humans feel small. I positioned the rolling ladder, climbed 2 rungs, and reached for the spine. It was heavier than I anticipated. The center of gravity shifted the moment I tipped it, the dead weight of the book sliding dangerously against my wrist. I gripped my teeth, bracing my forearm against the shelf, refusing to ask for help. I could feel the ligaments straining, the cold brass corner digging into the tender meat of my palm. It was a matter of leverage, simple physics. But physics was failing me. The book was slipping. Then the light behind me was blocked. "Let me." It wasn't a question. Before I could protest, a hand reached up past my shoulder. It didn't just support the book. It covered my hand entirely. Serafina's palm pressed flat against the back of mine, her fingers curling over my knuckles to grip the spine. The contact was absolute. It wasn't the static shock of dry carpet. It was a deep, resonant current that shot straight down my arm and settled, heavy and hot, in the pit of my stomach. Her skin was cool, startlingly so against the flush of my exertion, but her grip was firm. There was a surprising strength in her, a hidden solidity beneath the silk and the boredom that I hadn't accounted for. She wasn't just decorative. She was force. We stood there, suspended in the amber light of the stacks. The book was balanced between us, a heavy, ancient thing, but I lost all awareness of its weight. My world narrowed down to the sensation of her chest pressing lightly against my back, the heat of her body radiating through the layers of our clothes. The scent of her, that complex mix of sandalwood, rain, and something uniquely, biologically her, flooded my senses. It was overwhelming. It drowned out the smell of dust and leather. It made my head swim. I stopped breathing. I literally forgot how to exhale. The silence in the aisle changed quality again. It wasn't tense anymore. It was vibrating. I could hear the tiny, sharp intake of her breath near my ear, a sound so intimate, it felt like a secret whispered directly into my bloodstream. She didn't pull away. She held the position, her hand locking mine to the book, her body shielding me from the drop. For 3 seconds, time ceased to be linear. We were just two bodies in a narrow canyon of books, bound together by the weight of history and the sudden, terrifying gravity of desire. I stared at the brass clasp of the folio, unable to turn my head, terrified of what would happen if I looked at her from this distance. If I turned, our mouths would be inches apart. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wanted to turn. The professionalism I clung to, the armor of the curator, shattered. I wasn't thinking about preservation or provenance. I was thinking about the pressure of her fingers. I was thinking about how easy it would be to lean back. "I have it," she whispered. Her voice was a low hum against my shoulder blade, vibrating through my rib cage. "I know," I managed to choke out. My voice sounded wrecked, foreign to my own ears. She pulled the book free, taking the weight of it fully into her own arms as she stepped back. The loss of contact was abrupt, a physical coldness that rushed in to fill the space where she had been. I nearly stumbled coming off the ladder. I turned to face her, my pulse thundering in my ears like a drum. She was holding the folio against her chest, her cheeks flushed a faint, dusty pink, the first crack in her perfect porcelain composure. She looked at me, her eyes wide, dark, and dilated. The air between us was so charged, it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. I reached for my cataloging pencil on the shelf, my hand shaking so badly that I fumbled it. The plastic clattered loudly against the wood, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet stack. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't bend down. I didn't trust my legs. "Thank you," I said. It was a dismissal. It was a plea. She nodded, once, sharp and jerky, and turned on her heel, carrying the book down the aisle as if she were fleeing a fire. I stood there, gripping the edge of the shelf, staring at the empty space she had left behind. My skin still burned where she had touched me. We didn't speak of the touch, but it hung in the air like ozone before a storm. By Friday, the sanctuary of the library had been breached. The silence I had carefully cultivated was shattered, not by a storm, but by the aggressive, logistical violence of the charity gala. The Blackwood estate was hosting the city's elite, and the library, with its panoramic views and architectural grandeur, was designated as the overflow space for champagne and silent auctions. I arrived to find my workspace colonized. The long oak table, usually a bastion of academic order, was covered in white linen and towering floral arrangements that smelled of hothouse lilies, a scent I find cloying, smelling faintly of funerals and desperate preservation. Event planners with headsets moved through the stacks like an invasive species, measuring sightlines and debating the placement of ice sculptures. I retreated to the mezzanine, taking my laptop and a stack of correspondence to the furthest shadow I could find. From this vantage point, I became a spectator to the theater of wealth, watching the set being dressed for a play I couldn't afford a ticket to. Then I saw the version of her that the magazines bought. Serafina entered the library flanked by her father and a team of assistants. She wasn't the scholar in the oversized sweater who had debated art history with me in the dust. She was transformed, encased in a gown of liquid silver that clung to her frame like a second skin, designed to catch every photon of light in the room. It was beautiful, objectively, but to me, it looked like armor. Her hair was pulled back into a severe sculptural knot, exposing the long line of her neck and the diamond necklace that rested there. Stones so large they looked heavy, a cold weight pressing against her pulse. I watched her perform. That is the only word for it. She moved through the room with a practiced, lethal grace, stopping to approve a floral arrangement or nod at a planner's suggestion. Her smile was tight, a precise muscular contraction that didn't reach her eyes. It was a mask, flawless and impenetrable. She spoke to the staff with polite detachment, her voice pitched a chaotic octave higher than the low, resonant tone she used with me. This was public Serafina, the asset, the heiress, the shiny object to be displayed alongside the art collection. From the shadows of the mezzanine, the contrast made my stomach turn. Just yesterday, we had shared the weight of a book and the heat of a breath. Today, she looked like a different species. The distance between the mezzanine and the floor felt like miles. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened glass of a display case. Tweed blazer, sensible shoes, ink stain on my thumb, and felt the crushing reality of the distance between us. The intimacy of the stacks felt like a hallucination, a temporary glitch in the social order that had now been corrected. Halfway through the inspection, the mask slipped. The noise in the room was rising, the clatter of silverware, the bark of orders, the shrill ring of phones. I saw Serafina stop mid-sentence. Her hand went to her temple, a small, sharp gesture of distress. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and darting, not seeing the flowers, but feeling the sonic assault. I recognize that look. I know the feeling of the world turning up the volume until it becomes physical pain, the static in the head that drowns out thought. She was overstimulated, drowning in the sensory chaos that her life demanded she enjoy. She turned away from her father, murmuring an excuse, and walked straight toward the back of the room, toward the quietest corner, directly beneath my perch on the mezzanine. She didn't see me at first. She just leaned against the mahogany shelving, closing her eyes and exhaling a breath that shook the diamonds on her chest. She looked exhausted, stripped raw by the lights and the noise. I shouldn't have moved. I should have stayed hidden in the safety of my station. But I shifted, my chair scraping softly against the floor. Her head snapped up. Her eyes found me instantly in the gloom of the upper level. For a moment, nobody moved. The florists below continued their noisy work, but the air between us cleared. She didn't put the mask back on. She looked at me with naked relief, as if my presence was the only solid thing in a room full of smoke and mirrors. She didn't smile, and she didn't speak, but the look was loud. It was an acknowledgement of the shared frequency we operated on, a silent confession that the diamonds were heavy and the noise was too much. She looked at me across the room, and for a second, the crowded hall emptied out. The gala had evaporated, leaving behind only the ghost of expensive perfume and the aggressive, rhythmic drumming of a storm that had swallowed the city whole. By 2 a.m, the Penthouse was no longer a stage for the elite. It was a glass box suspended in a void of wind and rain. The florists had stripped the tables, the caterers had packed away the crystal, and the silence had returned. But it was different now. It was bruised. I should have left hours ago. My contract didn't require these hours, and my eyes were burning with a fatigue that made the catalog cards blur into nonsense. But I couldn't go back to my empty apartment, to the silence that I usually craved but now feared would feel too small. So I stayed, using the deadline as a shield, burying myself in the provenance of a collection of 17th century letters. The storm outside lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the world beyond the glass into a chaotic abstraction of gray and black. It felt like we were underwater, isolated from the earth, trapped in a pressure vessel of mahogany and history. I didn't hear the elevator. I didn't hear footsteps. I only realized I wasn't alone when the scent of ozone and rain cut through the smell of old paper, sharper and more immediate than the storm. "You're still here." I turned. Serafina stood in the archway of the stacks. The silver armor of the gala was gone. The diamonds were back in the vault. She was wearing a slip of dark silk that hung loose around her frame, her feet bare against the cold floor. Her hair was down, stripped of the sculptural pins, falling in dark waves that softened the severe lines of her face. She held 2 glasses of dark red wine, her fingers loose around the stems. She looked human. She looked wrecked. "The catalog is due on Monday," I said, my voice sounding rough in the quiet. It was a lie. The catalog was finished. I was just lingering in the aftershocks of the week. "The catalog will wait," she said, walking toward me. She didn't stop at the other side of the table this time. She walked around it, invading my sanctuary, and set one of the glasses down on my stack of index cards. The condensation ring bloomed immediately on the paper, a violation of archival protocol that I found I didn't care about in the slightest. "Drink. The sharks have gone home. It's just the wreckage now." She sank onto the floor, her back resting against the shelves of the poetry section, ignoring the velvet chairs entirely. She pulled her knees to her chest, the silk pooling around her, and looked up at me. It was an invitation to dismantle the hierarchy. I hesitated for a heartbeat, the curator in me screaming about boundaries. And then I abandoned the chair. I sat on the floor opposite her, the Persian rug rough under my hands, the wine glass heavy in my palm. "It's a cage, isn't it?" she asked softly, swirling the wine. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the rain assault the glass. The expectations, the smiling, the pretending that you don't hear the noise. "It's loud," I admitted, taking a drink. The wine was complex, heavy with tannins, warming the cold pit in my stomach. But the library is quiet. "Only because you're in it," she said. She turned her head, resting her cheek on her knee, looking at me with that dangerous, unflinching clarity. "Before you came, it was just a room where my father kept his money. Now it feels like a place where things can actually breathe." She reached up and pulled a book from the shelf behind her without looking. It was a slender volume of Rilke. She opened it with a familiarity that told me she had been here before, in the dark, looking for answers in the text. "Read this," she whispered. She didn't hand me the book. She leaned forward, sliding across the small distance of the rug until her shoulder brushed mine. She held the book open between us, her finger tracing a stanza. I leaned in to read, my head bowing next to hers. The proximity was dizzying. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, smell the wine on her breath mixed with the damp electricity of the storm. The text blurred, but her voice brought it into focus. "I want to unfold," she read, her voice dropping to a register that wasn't meant for public consumption. It was a breathy whisper, vibrating directly against my collarbone. "I don't want to stay folded anywhere, because where I am folded, there I am a lie." She stopped reading, but she didn't pull back. She turned her face toward me, the movement so slight that her hair brushed against my cheek. The storm outside was loud, a chaotic roar of wind and water. but the quiet between us was screaming. We were two women sitting on the floor of a glass tower, reading poetry about the terror of being seen, while the air in the room grew so heavy, it felt like it might crush us both. Serafina closed the book. The sound was soft, barely a whisper of paper against paper, but in the pressurized atmosphere of the room, it landed with the finality of a gavel strike. She didn't hand the volume back to me. She set it down on the Persian rug, deliberately placing it outside the neat, defensive perimeter of my workstation. The storm continued to batter the glass, but the immediate threat was no longer the weather. It was the sudden, terrifying clarity in her eyes. "You finished the catalog at 8 o'clock, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cool precision of someone who had been tracking my metrics. I stiffened, my hand tightening around the stem of the wine glass. The professional mask I had managed to keep halfway intact slipped further. I was reviewing the provenance of the 17th century maps. The ink density on the— "You don't review," she cut in, her voice low and smooth. "You are surgical. You touch a book once, you extract the data, and you move on. I've watched you for 5 days. You finished the work 3 hours ago." She stood up then, the dark silk of her slip flowing around her like liquid shadow. I scrambled to my feet as well, the instinct to retreat overriding the lingering warmth of the wine. I needed distance. I needed the oak table between us. I needed to be the curator again, not the woman sitting on the floor reading poetry with the client. "I should go," I said, setting the glass down with a clatter that betrayed the tremor in my hands. "It's late. The storm." I moved toward the archway that led to the elevator, the escape route that would take me back to the safety of the street level. But Serafina moved faster. She didn't run. She simply glided into the space between me and the exit. She wasn't threatening, exactly. She didn't raise her hands or raise her voice. She just stood there, a slender, silk-clad barrier that I physically could not cross without touching her. "Stop running," she said. The command was soft, but it hooked into my chest. "Tell me why you're still here." "I told you," I snapped, the defensive anger rising now, hot and sharp. "I take my work seriously. Unlike some people, I don't have the luxury of treating this collection as a backdrop for my moods. Is that what you think I'm doing?" She stepped closer, invading the personal space I had tried so desperately to maintain. "You think this is a game? You think I'm just the bored little rich girl playing with the staff because the gala was dull? I think you are accustomed to owning things," I countered, my voice rising, the frustration of the last week finally boiling over. "I think you look at people the same way you look at these books, as interesting diversions to pass the time until the next season starts. And I am not a diversion, Serafina. I am a professional. I am the hired help." "You are a liar," she breathed. The word hung in the air, vibrating. She took another step. I backed up until my hips hit the edge of the mahogany table. I was trapped. "If you were just the help, you would have left when the clock struck 5, she said, her eyes searching mine, stripping away the last of my defenses. "If I were just a client, you wouldn't be trembling. You aren't staying for the books. You aren't staying for the money. Tell me the truth." I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the exhaustion beneath the defiance, the desperate need that mirrored my own. I saw the woman who felt like a lie everywhere except in this room. The anger drained out of me, leaving only a terrifying, raw vulnerability. "I stay," I whispered, the truth tearing its way out of my throat. "Because the silence in my own life is deafening. I stay because the silence here is only bearable when you are in it." The admission shattered the power dynamic completely. The vertical hierarchy of employer and employee dissolved into dust. We were just two terrified women standing in a glass box in the sky, terrified of the drop. "I know," she said, her voice breaking on the edge of the words. "There were 1,000 reasons for you to leave, and I was the only reason to stay. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a structure collapsing, the beautiful, terrible noise of heavy walls coming down. Serafina didn't smile. She didn't triumph. She simply let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the moment I walked out of the elevator 5 days ago. The distance between us, which had been a battlefield of intellect and class, evaporated. She closed the final inch. It wasn't a collision. It was a docking. Her hands came up, not to push me away, but to grip the lapels of my tweed blazer, pulling me down from the high, safe shelf of my professional detachment. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain, vibrating with a raw frequency I had never heard in the boardroom. To be surrounded by people who only see the reflection, who only see the name, the portfolio, the potential for a donation? You looked at me in the stacks, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone was actually reading the text. I didn't look away. The lingering gaze that had terrified me in the aisles was now the only thing anchoring me to the earth. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I finally, deliberately, broke the cardinal rule of the archive. I touched the art. My fingers brushed the line of her jaw, tracing the tension there until it softened under my touch. Her skin was warm, alive, a stark contrast to the cold vellum I spent my life protecting. "I see you," I said. It was the only provenance that mattered. I saw the fatigue behind the polish, the scholar starved for debate, the woman who read Rilke on the floor because the furniture was too stiff to hold her grief. She leaned into my hand, her eyes fluttering shut, surrendering to the contact. We didn't kiss. Not yet. That would have been too simple, too easy a resolution for the complexity of what we had built in this glass box. Instead, she rested her forehead against mine. The contact was electric, a grounding wire that carried the current of everything we hadn't said. The physical closeness was overwhelming. I could feel the heat radiating from her chest, the rapid, shallow rhythm of her breathing syncing with my own. We stood there, breathing the same air, her hands clutching my jacket as if I were the only solid thing in a world of liquidity, my hand tangling in the dark waves of her hair. The world outside the glass, the storm, the father, the expectations, the millions of dollars in assets surrounding us, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her, the scent of rain, and the absolute, terrifying precision of this feeling. It was an intimacy far more dangerous than sex. It was recognition. "This isn't just a storm," she whispered against my skin, her eyes opening to search mine at this impossible range. "We can't just open the doors tomorrow and pretend the room hasn't changed. I can't go back to being the reflection." "The work is done," I murmured, my thumb brushing her cheekbone, memorizing the texture of her skin. "The catalog goes to print on Monday. My contract ends." "Then let it end," she said, pulling back just enough to look at me, her gaze fierce and possessive. "The contract ends. The employee leaves. But you aren't going anywhere that I can't follow. Meet me. Not here. Not in the cage. Meet me where the silence is ours to break." We made the agreement in the quiet dark, a promise spoken in the language of breath and touch. The library, once a vault of dead things, felt suddenly, violently alive. The storm began to fade, the rain slowing to a gentle rhythm against the glass, but the energy in the room remained high, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I knew, with the certainty of a historian recognizing a turning point, that the story wasn't ending. It was just starting. The door to the elevator waited, but I was in no rush to open it. Dawn broke over the city in a wash of gray light, illuminating a library that looked exactly the same, yet felt fundamentally altered. The books were cataloged, the history preserved, but the most valuable discovery wasn't on the shelves. It was the woman who had walked out of them with me. The silence was no longer heavy. It was full. If you've ever found an unexpected connection in a quiet place, subscribe to hear where the story goes next.